We return, we return, we return, return again. We return, we return, we return, return again and again to love, love, love. We return again to love.
We return,
we return,
we return,
we return, we return,
return again. We return,
we return,
we return,
we return, we return, return again and again to truth. We return again to truth. Hashivenu Adonai elecha v'nashuva Chadesh Yameinu k'kedem. Yalalai, 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 yalalai,
we return, we return,
we return, we return,
return again. We return,
we return,
we return,
we return, we return, return again and again to you. We return again to
Shema Kolenu Adonai וקבל ברחמים וברצון את תפילתנו. Won't you hear our voice above all the noise and have mercy on our souls? We are in your care. Won't you hear our prayer and forgive us, forgive us. Shema Koleinu Adonai Eloheinu Hus verachem aleinu vekabel berachamim uvratzon et tfilateinu. When we've lost our way, give us one more day to return to what is true. Won't you take us in so we can begin a new year? Won't you please hear? Shema Koleinu Adonai Eloheinu.
Welcome to Blank and Jewish, navigating Jewish spaces as a person of color and minority spaces as a Jew. This program is the first in our Barrett Conversation series this year with a focus on Jews of color. We are strengthening our internal diversity to strengthen our Jewish future. I'm Veronica Abney, a member of Temple Emmanuel's Jews of Color Task Force that helped assemble this year's Barrett Conversation series. And I want to give you some context on why our synagogue has made this a year-long focus. As America becomes more diverse, so does the Jewish community. Recent studies indicate that currently people of color make up 12 to 15% of the Jewish community, and that number is steadily increasing. Yet, most Jewish institutions do not yet reflect this reality. We are building a roadmap for Temple Emmanuel as a spiritual home for liberal Jews who are diverse ethnically, culturally, and religiously. The Jews of Color Task Force has organized a year of programs, celebrations, and trainings for all to experience. I want to thank the Barrett Family Foundation and my fellow task force members for making this program possible. It makes me proud. There is much diversity amongst Jews of color, but we share many of the same experiences. For instance, if the source of our Jewishness is not immediately apparent, we may be seen as being foreign-born. A long time ago, I remember being asked, "Where is your home?" "New York," I said. The other person said, "But I mean, like, where were you born?" Again, I said, "New York." I think this person couldn't imagine that I was a Black Jew from the United States. She hadn't seen very many at that point. Today, we are delighted to have with us two experts to help us understand the joys, complexities, and challenges of carrying multiple minority identities like this. Our first guest is April Baskin. She is the former Vice President of Audacious Hospitality for the Union for Reform Judaism. She is a longtime advocate for Jewish diversity and inclusion, a member of the Sela Leadership Network and the Schusterman Foundation's Insight Fellowship. She is the former president of the Jewish Multiracial Network. She now lives in Senegal and is the founder of JoyousJustice.com, a consulting project that seeds and leads systemic change in the Jewish community and beyond. Our second guest is Emiliana Gareca, who, along with being an award-winning event producer, is the founder and executive director of Women's March Los Angeles and a member of our neighboring congregation, Temple Isaiah. LGBT initiatives, youth membership programs, and gender equality movements are all causes close to her heart and are a priority in both her personal and professional lives. Our conversation today will be moderated by Rabbi Sarah Bassin. You'll have the opportunity to anonymously ask your own questions of our experts through the chat function. We encourage you to ask what's on your mind without self-consciousness. We think it's important to speak to what people really want to hear. We will try to get to as many questions as we can. Please join me now in welcoming our experts.
Thank you, Veronica. I want to thank you specifically, but also our entire Jews of Color task force that has helped us behind the scenes in putting together these programs. And I want to add a couple of things about April Baskin, who has been quite busy as of late. She is also the Racial Justice Director at the Jewish Social Justice Roundtable and co-host of Jews Talk Racial Justice podcast. So April, welcome. Emmy, welcome as well. We're delighted to have you both with us. I think before we dive into some of the macro questions, I want to ask, I guess, Emmy, we'll start with you. I want you to speak to a little bit more on the personal side of your identity and tell us about your bio, something that isn't really communicated through all of your professional accomplishments.
Oh my goodness. So first, thank you everyone for spending your afternoon with us. I'm Emiliana Guereca. I am the Executive Director of Women's March Los Angeles, and I'm a Latina Jew. So most people, you have to actually tell them what that means. But I moved from Chicago to Los Angeles to finish school at UCLA. I grew up in Chicago. I grew up in what people call the ghetto. I grew up entrenched in Black community. We were probably one of the few Latinos that lived in what was then called Cabrini Green. But we also had a center around the corner from where I grew up that was called Jewtown. At the time, I didn't know what they meant, right? What was meant by, are you going to Jewtown and whatnot. So I grew up really, really entrenched in Latin culture and Black culture in Chicago. I'm one of 13 kids. I am the seventh, and as my mom says, the problem child. I am the first to do a lot of things in my family. I'm the first one to go to university. I am the first one to move out and not be married. That was a difficult task for my parents. I am also the first one to convert and marry a nice Jewish man, as my mom calls it, but not the last in my family. So I am also the first one to own businesses within my family. I actually met my husband at the restaurant that I waited tables on that we now co-own in Los Angeles. So I am the first of many for a lot of things within my family and how I grew up. And now I'm raising my kids as Latino Jews and having to explain to them what that means. I think, my goodness. So I'm going to open it up and, pass it to April, but I'm open for questions because a lot of people don't realize that, yes, Latino Jews do exist. And now I have two more boys walking around in that, and actually a Latina Jew, Carmen Shea, as well. So we're out here.
Thank you. April, add some color to your bio for us.
Hello, it's so wonderful to be here with all of you. Such an honor and such a pleasure to follow Emmy. What brilliance and energy. So I'm excited to see how the fusion of the two of us plus Rabbi Bassin, the magic that will be made this afternoon. Okay, so there's so many different things I could say. I think for me, what's live for me right now is multi and inter, is multiplicity, is intersectionality, is, I think there's a number of different things I could say, but in terms of what's not in my bio, I grew up in a very multicultural, well, I've had a very multicultural journey. I grew up in a predominantly, from fourth grade through high school, white community in Northern California, at least in my hometown, and then I went to a magnet public high school in Sacramento, California, that did have a tremendous amount of diversity. But overall, so I'm going to speak, Emiliana spoke really beautifully in terms of specifics, and I think I'm going to sort of speak more broadly and theoretically in terms of what's not covered in my bio is my passion about the power of choice. That as someone who has a very strong oppression analysis and sociological knowledge and information in both my training and also really intrigued about and in love with, but in my own multiracial, multicultural background, that I think so often there are many false choices that are set up. And throughout my work, I am continually interested in not necessarily accepting everything or saying everything fits together, but looking for innovative solutions and strategies that don't dispose of, how do I say this? In the midst of a lot of difficulty and hardship, I still think that there is a lot of abundance and opportunity and choice. And it's not always necessarily a path that is for the faint of heart. But I believe that in the gray and within the texture and nuance, whether it's in our movements, in our communities and leadership on the entrepreneurial path I'm on right now in terms of my work with Joyous Justice, that I often call it my mixed chick pattern. But I think what might not come through in my bio is that having not grown up in as segregated of an experience, having grown up in a multiracial family and having gone to a multiracial high school and sought out, continually seeking out multiracial opportunities, and I promise I'll get more concrete as I go, but I think what I want to say is I'll switch gears a little bit and then I'll stop in a moment so we can move on. One of the best gifts that my parents gave me is, and I apply this in my life coaching work and in my group coaching work, is navigating circumstances with honesty and taking time to heal, and also not letting our circumstances determine our future. Still holding on to the beauty of our dreams, and that's something throughout my journey. So what may not be included in my bio are different medical challenges, are different family emergencies, are different horrific encounters with law enforcement at times that were very traumatizing. And in spite of those different experiences, my family and I have still chosen to say, we still believe in the beauty of our dreams and we may have detours, but we are going to go for them. And so behind a lot of those accomplishments are medical leaves from college, are nights and weeks of tearful crying, but taking strides to continually build resilience and move in the direction of my dreams. It's great to be here with all of you.
Thank you, April. I mean, one of the reasons why we wanted you to specifically as part of this panel is exactly that last piece that you mentioned is the resilience that I've had the personal opportunity to witness both of you demonstrate tremendous resilience in really difficult public spaces, navigating some of these questions about multiple minority identities. And one of the things I think a lot of folks are curious about is what it's actually like that no matter what space you walk into, you are a minority, right? If you walk into most Jewish spaces and Jewish institutions, you're a minority as a person of color. And if you walk into organizations for racial justice oftentimes those are bereft of Jews. So what is it like to walk into any space as a minority, and what's the code switching that you found yourself doing? Either one of you can take that one to go first.
I'll say this, that the first time, my husband's last name is Zeidenfeld, and the first time someone referred to me as Miss Zeidenfeld, I was looking for my mother-in-law, because I was used to my Latina name, Emiliana Guereca. I had built my career on that. My kids at Temple, they attended preschool. My husband's parents are co-founders of Temple Isaiah. That's how he was part of the first preschool class there. And my kids having to defend that I wasn't their nanny was difficult, right? That was probably the most difficult thing. I've had someone stop me around the corner from my house, because I don't live too far from Isaiah, of, am I driving my boss's car? Right? So navigating that, and then navigating I'm not Jewish enough, or navigating I'm not Latina enough, has been sort of difficult. But I think resiliency for me is to really show my kids that we belong. And that's how I feel about my temple. We belong. We're not just part of it, or, that they belong. And so explaining to them what a bias is, and that when someone speaks to them, if I'm their nanny, as a matter of fact, my 8-year-old has said to people, no, she's not our nanny. She doesn't even clean our house. That's our mom. Because he doesn't understand sort of what they mean. But having to explain that to them along the way, I think that has been a lot more difficult than I expected.
Do you think that they're still in that space of just trying to process through the factual nature of those questions rather than understanding the underlying implications behind them? Or are they starting to pick up on some of the racial undertones of those questions?
I have been really clear about the racial undertones. And because we live in Los Angeles, right? Because sometimes when they go on a play date, they will find other nannies there. And my kids have the opposite. My kids think that could be their mom, right? So explaining to them that there is a bias, and that people will have biases for them because they're Jewish. They will also have biases for them because they're Latino. So that they have to recognize that. They have to recognize that in order to confront it, in order to talk through who they are and that they belong.
Thank you. April.
I wrote a thesis about this. So in part, I think what's interesting, right? So like, if I look specifically or reflect specifically on your question, there's like a few different branches that come out of that, right? Because you asked it in this way, your identity as a woman of color and as a Jew must put us in a position of a minority, right? So there's just like the neutral fact, separate from systems of oppression, of just, even if oppression didn't exist, right? Like, I would have this identity that is unique compared to other people. But as I heard someone call you Emmy, and you introduced yourself as Emiliana. Do you have a preference for how I should reference you, fellow?
Emmy.
What was that?
Most people know Emmy.
Okay, perfect. All right. So, but yet as Emmy was saying, right, we are navigating these spaces as women who are also navigating systems of oppression. So it's not just, because if it were just that we were unique in and of itself, that wouldn't carry much weight, but it's happening in a context where there are all of these different meanings and different layers that come on to it. And there's so much to say. What I think I want to say at a high level first, that's on my mind a lot these days, is that my ideal for the Jewish community is that we get to a place where there is a healthy amount of visibility for people who are Jews of color, or there are any number of different terms and phrases for people with a diversity of racial and ethnic backgrounds who also have Jewish identity. That we just have, like, on a continuum, like, average levels, that we're seen in a way that's similar, at a similar level. In the meantime, right now, what often happens, and I talked about this in my thesis about the experiences and identities of Jewish young adults of color in American Judaism, is that there's often extreme experiences of extreme invisibility, as Emmy said, where at times Jews are mistaken, and at times they're so mistaken that people don't even engage them in Jewish space, because they're seen as other and just aren't engaged at all, are seen as a guest, as hired help, and or as a threat, or we're hyper visible and get asked, where are we from? And we are exotic, which at times people perceive that or mean that as a compliment, mean that as a compliment or a kind thing to say, but for many of us who receive it, it's not received as positively, right? But back to my point, as someone who's been organizing Jews of color for a long time, experience inherently in itself, and also because I've engaged in different healing spaces, both traditional therapy as well as anti-oppressive healing communities. So I've been able to navigate a number of these hurtful experiences and process them. And at any point, if my West African husband gets too loud, just let me know, and I can let him know to lower his voice. We're still hosting guests from our break fast, and I often say that like God put like an amplifier in his throat, like a boombox. He's like really loud. So sorry about that. It's just hospitality happening. So I can't imagine. I remember once I was walking my dog late at night when I was in high school in my senior year. So much has happened since then. And I stepped out in the night, and the light from the street hit my leg. And in the night light, because of my lighter skin, my leg looked white in that moment. And in that moment, I know, like for that split second, I no longer saw myself as a woman of color. And my life and my purpose like vanished. Like I didn't have any context for understanding my purpose in life, my meaning, which is not to say that being a person of color is the only source of meaning, but it has become something that has become deeply a part of me, as is my Judaism. And there's a lot of meaning and strength that has come from the uniqueness of this identity. But what I'm trying to get to is that for Jews of color, a key part of the work at times is also working on the various forms of our internalized oppression. And part of that is the isolation. And I find at times, especially in the early days and even now, for Jews of color, we often are so used to being the only one at times that when we are together, we need to reconceptualize ourselves of actually having other people to talk to and other people who are also brilliant and have been the only one and the big fish in their pond. And so I think that that's also important too, because that starts to get us back to the place of seeing the sanctity of the specificity of our experience, and also saying, we don't have to be on all the time. We don't have to be explaining ourselves all the time, ideally, and we can just function in our community and be valued for the uniqueness of the richness of our specific racial and ethnic backgrounds, and also drive our kids to school without being confused as the hired help.
Thank you. I want to step away from the personal experience and turn a little bit more to the spaces that you two have operated in the public sphere as leaders in the community. Emmy, I first encountered you as you were planning the Los Angeles Women's March. And I want to make a distinction here that the Los Angeles March was not actually associated with the DC Women's March and those leaders, where there was some direct experiences and comments of anti-Semitism, but you still had to navigate the blowback of some of that, and also navigate some speakers here where there was concern of anti-Semitism. So I'm curious to get your behind the scenes perspective of what that's actually been like trying to navigate those waters.
Oh my goodness. So first I'll say that I started organizing Women's March Los Angeles specifically because I did not want the women's movement to miss Latinas, to miss Jewish women. So that was why I stepped into organizing this. For me, it was really clear that we were going to get missed. And the actual women that I first invited to organize with me were Jewish women. They were, it was Dina Katz, it was Irene Shackness, it was women from my community when we started organizing. And as we organized and we were getting the questions about what was going on in DC, there was anti-Semitic rhetoric. At no point did I think I needed to defend that. At no point did I think that I needed to have a conversation with them, because this was part of our unity principles. We had all agreed as to why we were organizing. And so it was really a shock to me that we had agreed on why we were all organizing. So defending the anti-Semitic rhetoric was not easy, because there was nothing to defend. This is what they said. This is what they were not clarifying. But I also, from my perspective, I also feel like I had to speak to them. Did you really mean this? This was not part of why we were organizing. And so having to talk through and understand that they really meant some of these things made us walk away. We needed to really separate ourselves from that, because that is not what we stood for. And so having to also navigate speakers' comments on stage, when we work on putting together a speakers program, we work with partners, we work with organizations that we work throughout the year. And so we invite them to speak on the work that we have done together throughout the year. As the speaker program comes together, we talk about what is and what isn't. But what was interesting to me was that some of the speakers had some tough criticism of Israel. Some speakers do tend to go off cost, but my concern was more that the speakers were not asked to talk further on what their speaking points were. My concern was that as an organization, I had let my community down. As an organizer, I needed to do a better job of really vetting some of these speakers, regardless of what work we had done. And so once you hand the mic to someone, you don't know exactly what they're going to say. And it's really difficult to take the mic away from someone that is already speaking to hundreds and thousands of people. So that space has been difficult. What I will say, and I'm completely grateful for, is that my community of really stood with me, that I held an open conversation and talked through what was and what wasn't. But the fact that everyone was shocked that I was Jewish, from the East Coast groups to the groups that I organized with, I didn't know you were Jewish. Okay, so if you had known I was Jewish, you wouldn't have said that. So it was not something that I thought would ever come from a women's movement, as we talked about being looked at less than, about not being equal. So at no point did we ever think that was going to happen.
Thank you.
And I'm still learning. I'm still learning on it.
If you're just joining us, I'm here with Emmy Guerreca, who is the founder of the Los Angeles Women's March, and also with April Baskin, who is a racial justice entrepreneur of many varieties. In our context, most famously, the former vice president of Audacious Hospitality at the Union for Reform Judaism. April, I'm gonna throw a similar angle question to you. We're starting to get some questions pop up in the chat that you might be seeing about this nervousness around anti-Israel and anti-Semitism in racial justice circles, and how do you navigate that? And what are the messages that white Jews need to hear about the complications of choosing to show up in spaces that you don't agree on everything, maybe?
So I think what I will say is it's so important in this moment that we show up. I will never forget when I was, I can't remember if I was on that panel, if I was in the room and he was on the panel. I think in this case, I was not on the panel at that time. And Yehuda Webster once said something that I was like, that is my truth. And I made my involvement in the or be a member of this community. And that is basically a similar sentiment I have to a variety of spaces that I am in. I do have certain standards around certain thresholds of bigotry and of oppression. And I recognize that, as Adrienne Maree Brown said it, we are all swimming in a sea of harm. We are all navigating systemic oppression. And so it's very important to me, specifically for Jews in particular, because a core consequence of anti-Semitism is isolation of Jews, that as much as we can, when we feel safe, and it feels true to us. So I'm not encouraging Jews who really don't feel comfortable entering certain spaces to enter those spaces, but I am encouraging folks that if there is a group and you love the work they're doing, I would encourage you to reach out and get involved. And if and when anti-Semitism shows up, it is likely at times going to show up because anti-Semitism, similarly to most forms of oppression, even though anti-Semitism often operates fundamentally in sort of opposite ways to other forms of oppression, is systemic. That means it's everywhere, much of the time. And so I don't make my involvement in a space conditional on there being, upon there being no anti-Semitism. If I do see a willingness, which I do see in most progressive spaces that I'm a part of, a willingness to evolve, I'm open to being there. And, I would even say specifically with reference to some things that have happened in the past, even when there's a delay at times in people saying things, as someone who has had people in my own family, my brother was once removed. Actually, I can't share that story because I just remember he shared that with me about his thesis, and he said that anonymously, so let me not say that. I have had people in my personal life go through horrifically humiliating stories. Somebody I talked to for my thesis went to a group going through yeshiva, and she was pushed down a flight of stairs as a child, and she is still a devout Orthodox Jew. And I am not saying that these things are acceptable, but what I am saying is, particularly in this moment, when we are facing global warming, and to me, racism and oppression and global warming are very much intertwined in different ways, and the thought patterns that allow both of those things to exist are interdependent on one another. It is very important when we can and when we feel comfortable to find ways to stay in the conversation, to come to the table, to be in dialogue. And I think particularly it gets more complicated and it goes beyond, I'm going to wrap up my comments for this specific piece, and there's more questions that will come. This is nuanced work. And so depending upon the identities and the positions we occupy, I recently came up with a great metaphor in the last year that I'm very excited about that I haven't shared with many groups. But at times, I think what people also attribute to anti-Semitism, and often it can be both, I'm really into both and, it can be that anti-Semitism may be a part of it, is that think about it in some ways in terms of some contexts. And so I'm not saying there are real, very real, indisputable instances of anti-Semitism. That's not what I'm referring to right now. But when you enter a new community, I think it's helpful for us to remember that in traditional Jewish practice, people who want to convert to Judaism are turned away 3 times. 3 times. And then once they go through a conversion process, they're usually not invited up to the bima to daven, like to read from the Torah while they're in that conversion process. And I think some of the things at times that Jews experience is essentially like the equivalent of certain groups being like, are they about to bring pork to the oneg? Like, do they know how we operate here? Do they know what's going on? So I think that it's navigable, and I encourage people to get involved, but there also is a number of complexities and nuances that need to be navigated. I think at times what people read as rejection is actually people just being like, kind of like the equivalent of Jews, like, do they get how hard this is? Does this newcomer understand? Like, yes, that action was inspiring, but the organizing and doing the calling of hundreds of people and door knocking is just sweaty, hard work. And are they really up for it? And so have I experienced anti-Semitism in Black spaces? Absolutely. I've not experienced it very often. It often doesn't necessarily come up. My perception is here, and this is April's take, it's not an official take, this is my take, is that, and I think James Baldwin said this far more eloquently, but like I often experience your average Black person outside of progressive spaces mostly just sees Jews as like another form of white people. Like it's kind of like, it's like a neutral, it's not like this like rancor or anger. I have had one activist a few years back say something in the moment that was so surprising, and she was an elder and I wasn't quite sure what to say to her, that I was baffled. And it was actually in front of a rabbi who didn't read it as anti-Semitism. But I did it was pretty much textbook to me. And so it is something that is important. And I work with some fellow organizers around thinking about how we are educating our progressive partners around these issues, because it does need to be addressed. But there's too much at stake for me personally, for me to leave these movements when I do mostly see people who are willing to change. And at times, don't do it very well, but honestly, I've often seen that in the Jewish community about 10 years ago and even now, and that doesn't mean that they're not good people.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that I'm digesting as I've listened to both of you is that the litmus test that we often set up for people to participate in racial justice spaces with anti-Semitism is, is there not? And if there is, then you're out. And yet we're having these conversations about the difficulty of navigating Jewish institutional spaces, right, as a person of color. And we wouldn't think to apply that same kind of, well, if there's racism, then you must walk away, right? There's the choice to show up and be present for both of those types of spaces, and to navigate the difficulty that comes with that. Okay, so representing all white people, not really, but one of the things that I've sensed as this conversation has become much more present and unavoidable is that there's a real sense of anxiety among white folks of doing this well, right? And wanting to have conversations around race and racism and understand it better, but it feels like it can so easily go wrong. I can so easily say the wrong thing. So what advice do you have for well-intentioned white folks who are wanting to be in this work that doesn't throw the onus all back on people of color to reiterate and explain their experiences 1,000 times more over and relive all of your traumas? Who wants that one?
I'm going to say that, there's racializing happening in the United States, and that we need to listen to it. That when we talk about, and this is something that's always asked of me, do you support Black Lives Matter? Absolutely, from day one. If you told me that it was okay to kill Black men, that it's okay for what they are experiencing, and we really have nothing to talk about, right? But it's listening. It's listening to their experience. It is listening to how they want it fixed. What we may want to do may not be right for that group, right? So I think it more than anything, we can no longer turn away. We can no longer say this is not happening, right? And the trauma that Black and brown kids experience is real. And acknowledging that we may not have all the answers, but that we have to be allies, that there is hurt, that we need really, really to come together to heal this, right? So when we talk about, there's anti-Semitism, guess what? That hurts us. That hurts our Jewish community. So when they talk about racism, that is hurting them. That is hurting us, because once we see injustice like that, we can't turn away and we can't walk away, because it is in our ingrained community to help. It is. When you look at all of the work temples do or year round, whether it's feeding homeless, doing this, doing that, we put so much effort into making the world a better place. And this is one of those things that we listen is key, that we don't lead this, but we need to be allies. We need to say, you need help. You need waters at your march? I'm going to bring waters. You need, I don't know, a box of lunches. We're going to do that. So I would just say really listening and following, because the good leader is also a good follower.
Thank you. April?
So well said. Okay. Whew. This is Thank you, Emmy. Okay. Because there are different paradoxical statements within this work, right? So I'm trying to make this as bold and as clear as possible. Oh yeah, I could use the tagline from my podcast that came from Tracy, and she got it from somewhere. I can't remember. She'll remind me. Stay humble and keep going. Like, in a nutshell, that's what I would say to the white folks joining in terms of the framing of the question, right? Like, we gotta do more. I'm really big on, and particularly tonight, some of these larger themes, and something that's coming up repeatedly in our society right now is the need to face the unfaceable, is the need to face climate change, is the need to really come face to face and face the unfaceable of our country's horrific past that it has yet to deal with. So, I think there's the current manifestations of this work, of this oppression and trauma playing out. And I think that we're just living in, there's so many places to get involved, right? And there's so many different ways to get involved. Besides stay humble and keep going, whether you join the ranks of amazing folks like Bryan Stevenson in terms of helping this country begin to reckon with its history and own it, I think that is something that is very important, whether we think about efforts around reparations or truth and reconciliation. I think it could look like a lot of different things, but I know that our country and each of us as individuals needs to deeply engage with teshuvah and healing. Racism in its many manifestations in this country across multiple different racial and ethnic groups has been deeply traumatizing for everyone involved, It most heavily impacted the people who are most directly impacted by that oppression, but in any oppressive context, everyone is dehumanized in that context. Professor Joy Leary-DeGruy talks about how one of the biggest impacts on white people through the process of enslavement and other extreme forms of racism around genocide of Native populations is losing access to full feelings and emotions. She often, in her presentation, one of her presentations, she shows an image of a lynching, and there's a little girl who's smiling. And she says, when people ask me what racism did to white people, it's right there. That little girl is not feeling anything at the sight of this happening. And we see this playing out in our society in terms of medical bias, in terms of racial bias in all different kinds of forms, in terms of people. There's obviously a lot more I can say, but there's just many different approaches here. And I think some of the key things to remember is to stay engaged, reach for support. It's helpful around this work to have a Chavruta or a support group or a group of people or your community or a group within your synagogue, perhaps a racial equity task force, right, of different groups that are of people who are engaging in this work. And the last piece that I would say is a slightly premature plug, but there's a specific program that I'm actually offering that I didn't talk about with Sarah, so this wasn't with Rabbi Bassin, so this wasn't planned, but I'm going to be rolling out a program called Whiteness Chavruta to help white folks work on these things over 6 months and do a deep dive around having these different conversations. And we're rolling out an institutional possible public cohort later this fall through the winter from around Hanukkah to Shavuot. And so if folks are interested, you can contact Rabbi Bassin or visit my website at Joyous Justice. And the reason why I created it, so getting back out of the sharing that specific piece, is because I would invite you. At times, Jews have I could go on here long, but I'll make it quick, wrap up so we can get to other questions. But there's a pattern among Jews that is length, and when it's overdone, it can also be a challenge of when at times white Ashkenazi Jews get scared. This is not universal, but it's a trend. There's a pattern called scared active, of going into action. And what I want to encourage white folks around race to do is to invite yourself, despite the pressure, to take more time, as Lauryn Hill said, and do what, like, how are you going to win if you ain't right within? Like, take the time that you need to read and process this stuff, to process those big questions that keep you from moving. You likely may have different barriers that keep you from showing up. Find someone you trust to engage around those questions, to engage around the fact that you're like, I love my bubby, my grandmother, and she was mad racist, and I still love her, and it makes it feel complicated. Like, those are things that can be worked through and discussed, and you can still love your bubby and be like, yeah, she could be mad racist at times, and I'm choosing to take a different path for my family moving forward. I'll stop there.
I so appreciate the modality of the Chavruta in this space, right? As having an accountability partner, somebody that's going to help keep you doing the work, right? It doesn't have to be a person of color. It can be another white person, right? But somebody that's going to keep you doing the work and also gives you a space to process through the things that you're not sure how to face, the internal doubts, your own racism that you're facing along the way. I think that's really important. As Rabbi Stephanie Kramer and I were co-writing our sermons on racism, right, as two white women rabbis this year, it was really important for us to be bouncing off of each other, our own experiences, our own racist thoughts and actions in the past, and navigating, sharing those on the public, in a public forum, but B, also coming to terms with what that means and what that models. Okay, so I'm going to ask you guys to do something a little hard and give us some real concrete do's and don'ts, right? What are the things that you do see most frequently, particularly in predominantly white Jewish communities, where if you could just stand up with a bullhorn and say, please stop doing this, or please keep going, what are the things really concretely that we need to know? Go bold.
I would say confront your own biases. I think we all have them. I think we all have biases on, whatever it is, but confront them, work through them, right? I also think that a lot of it really, really comes down to how society has seen white people as the saviors. We don't need saviors. We need allies. We need people to walk along with us in this, difficult life. I mean, as a person of color, you are born to fight. Like my first experience with activism was at 10, having to talk through why we were being discriminating in a housing project, right? So along the way, I think Jewish community really needs to look at some of the biases we inherently have. Like I said, it took me years to have play dates with our preschool friends because I didn't want my kids to explain to people that I was not the help. I didn't want my kids to have to do that every single time. So play dates, I was like, no, we're not doing play dates. Why? Because there's a bias. Also, sometimes when we showed up for play dates, we had the kids try to boss me around and ask me if I was on break. So the bias was already going into the kid's mind. The child is 5 or 6 years old and already knows that they should treat me differently, right? So I think just looking at the biases and seeing how we could be true allies and not saviors. We need people to walk with us and work along with us.
Yeah, very, very important. That humility piece is something that particularly Jews in social justice work, right? Like we're very used to leading rather than to walking alongside. It's a very important point. April, do we still have you for some of your concrete thing? There you are. All right. I see you're excited. Have at it.
All right. It's been a while since I've used a megaphone. I'm like pretending I have a megaphone. This is such a fun question. I love fun questions. Okay. So, what do I start with? You said for white Jews. Okay. So stay humble and keep going, right? Like keep showing up and practice humility and breath, like breathing at times because of the ways. So I often apply a trauma-informed lens. And again, not universal, but a common thread is that at times anyone can get triggered in any space, but it's helpful for us to remember at times that something's being said that reminds us of an old hurt, but that actually in this moment we're safe. And that doesn't mean that old pain doesn't need healing, but we can stay humble in that moment and wait and listen. Because oftentimes, because of our country is so segregated, I'm going to go back and make a book. Because our country is so segregated and because of the bias that Emmy spoke about, at times we hear something that actually we're missing things. And so if we just breathe and take in a little more with a little bit of time, we might realize like, okay, that landed with me this way, but I actually think that actually doesn't seem to be what's happening here. So let me stay engaged. Okay, here's another one. Don't believe the hype. Okay, so like, people in general are good. Most Black people are good. Most Jews are good. So in the media, when people are saying the Black community is so, I don't know what you're talking about. I grew up going to my Black grandparents' Southern church. And I know that there are churches out there that talk about Jews, but theirs didn't. Like, all I knew was that whenever I would go to their church or go to family things, I'd be like, April's Jewish. There can't be pork here. Where's the veggies? Like it was all about hospitality and love and like the one thing that they knew that like they needed to do in order to honor, right? And so like, don't believe the hype. I often see in media coverage that there's a lot of misinformation that's said either literally where people are misquoted or I notice in people's comments on social media that they say like this community feels this way. And I'm like, whether they're talking about Jews or Black people, I'm always like, oh, I know, actually, both communities are mostly gorgeous and worth fighting for. And yes, are there people who are like awful and like we need to work on their stuff? Yeah, like that's a thing, but that's not most people. Here's another one that's not so normal. Do your healing work. I am a big fan in life in general and in this line of work. I am not dogmatic about what that work is. It could be a therapist. It could be somatic healing. It could be co-counseling. It could be meditation. It could be regular exercise for you. But something, this world puts so much on, separate from when there's a pandemic and everything that's happening right now with the election season, like right now it's just exponential. Again, not necessarily universal, but I think for most people, it's important that we have pressure valve releases that allow us to unwind, to unpack, have a safe space to unpack. That has been critical for the advancement of my career, is having communities of practice where I could come and cry and say how humiliating or painful something was and be able to show up the next day because I did my work in my personal time to process the healing and get clear about where the pain was and where was the actual work or tweaking that needed to be done. So I think those are some of the main things. Oh, and the last thing, may I add one more one really quickly? And the better we get, meaning the better we get at diversity. Like people get so overwhelmed at this, but like, if y'all really understood like how amazing people of color are, I mean, you gotta already know that. Like, just like, I would just love it if we figured out economic inequality. Like, I am sure if we had more economic justice and equity in our country, let alone the world, like the cure for cancer, like better political systems, like so many solutions are right here, right now, but people live in food deserts. So like, whether it's out in the world and then in the Jewish community, like if you've ever had a chance, which probably most of the white Jews haven't, because that's not the purpose of the JOC affinity spaces, but JOC affinity spaces and like just spaces where there are lots of Jews of color are just so much fun. Like the music and the food and the jokes, and to be able to joke about Spike Lee films while talking about Talmud and the queerness, like all the layers that come with those intersectional identities is so rich. And then you mix that with Yiddish culture. So like, I know that it's not easy, but the better we get at it, like the more fun. There's also gonna be more complexity, and we'll work on that too, but like, it's also just gonna be so much more fun. So the better we get, the better it gets.
I love this idea of kaf zechut, of just giving the benefit of the doubt, to like not absorbing the narratives that we've told ourselves about communities that are different from us. And, you know, I can say that the moments where I've walked into public spaces of other communities, whether it's a Black mosque or a predominantly Black church, it has overwhelmingly been welcoming. And I was really taken one time by the fact that when I walked into a Black mosque in South Central, the imam 2 years later could not get over the fact that a white Jewish woman would walk into his space. And while he meant that to be complimentary to me, like it broke my heart for what that said of the lines of racial division and his understanding and lived experience of how harshly drawn those are in our city, and of people's trepidation in crossing them. And so I think it's such an important reminder, just this idea that, like, you know, the average place is going to welcome you and warn you where the pork's and the beans, right? And the average place is going to appreciate your presence when you come with that disposition of humility and allyship. But it does take a level of trepidation and fear to cross over yourself in order to do enough work to step into that space. Okay, so I'm going to turn us to a few of our congregant questions. We did have a few folks speak to the Israel anti-Semitism and racial justice spaces. April, I think we covered that, unless there's something else that you want to say on Israel and anti-Semitism?
Maybe a couple more things, as concisely as possible. I think this may, similar to what I said, I think things aren't, it's really important that we work to stay engaged. And when something feels off, something that I've learned as someone who has mixed heritage and has been proximate in many spaces is to give it a little time, both for me to process and make sure I am reading things correctly. Obviously, if there's something that's being harmful that's done, I need to interrupt or something, that's different. But I totally lost my train of thought for a moment, but there was a couple things I wanted to say. Oh yeah, that I think at times there's a debate in part, and it's, I would say a couple different things, which is not easy, especially with huge national things, to try to get directly to the source as possible. It's, I'm not seeing as much of it now, but I remember over the last, a couple of years ago that I saw a lot of misinformation in the news coverage. And as someone who was on the ground and in relationship with folks, I saw things being written at times when I was in the room, and I was like, I did not hear that thing. To judge that, but I would just try to hold that, if at all possible, when you're receiving something third, fourth, or fifth hand, that there's also bias involved. And the other thing I would say, and I'm sure there's some brilliance that I'm neglecting to say right now, but one thing that's coming up is that I think at times people get really stuck on, like, is it or isn't anti-Semitism? And not always. I think at times that is misused, but often it is. And to me, I think a good question to ask is, what are ways that we can mindfully work through this together? How can we address this? I want to add a mystical slant, and then I think I'll stop for now, which is that I began practicing a while back in my profession, and I found it to be really helpful, that when dissonance or something really negative shows up, and it's not always quite this simple, but I often try to frame it as, how does this further clarify what I want? And how am I working with my partners to move that forward? Because at times I find it, again, it's tricky, and I know this is not simple, but at times I see our community amplifying negative messages about ourselves rather than synthesizing what happened and using that moment to push out messaging that advances our safety and informs the public about who we are, but instead amplifies the image of the swastika. And so I think that we have more choice and power in these moments. But again, it takes in part having community and mindful practices around in order to not just be victim to the torrent, but begin to do things that begin to shift the tide and move us toward how are we going to be in better dialogue going forward? What am I doing both specifically in that situation or in my own sphere to begin to create a different scenario so that when our moment comes a few years from now, we are deep in community and we know how to show up effectively together across lines of difference.
I've been seeing some little tidbits in the news about a new platform by the Movement for Black Lives that, while there was much controversy a few years ago about, Israel and apartheid and very strong language being used, that appears to be absent this time around. Do you think that that's because of the people in the room? Do you think that it still remains to be seen what's actually going to happen with that? Like, what's your sense of what's going on in that conversation?
That's an excellent question. My sense is, maybe Emmy also has some information about this, is that the Movement for Black Lives recently released their preamble, and they are still planning to release more elements of their platform that has not been released yet. And my understanding, having not seen all of it, just having heard some of the conversation around it, is that there are going to be similar and some different parts that are forthcoming. So that is likely to be, unless there's some shift or change in direction or about face, that is going to be, it has not yet been seen. And what's interesting is that I think that I'm anticipating that we will see areas of progress and areas where by mainstream Jewish communal standards there has not been progress.
Any additions or modifications?
I would say that Movement for Black Lives is really putting forth the work that is necessary, right? And I also want to state that movements are decentralized. The Black Lives Matter movement is decentralized. I can go out tomorrow and say I'm leadership in Black Lives Matter because it's decentralized, right? So I think when we look at what media has put out, media, has spoken to an organizer out in Sheboygan, and they're really not connected to either the LA or DC, who is really the biggest part in leadership. So movements are messy. Some of them are disorganized, I'll say, because I'm in the middle of a very disorganized one. And most of us are volunteers. I'm a volunteer. I volunteer my time to Women's March Los Angeles and voter education. So I would say to really get to the source, I think Movement for Black Lives is really putting forth the work and looking at it. But also, more importantly, this is where it gets difficult and we still need to stay in the room. I think that this is where people might say, well, we're going to walk away from it. We can't. We need to also be able to stay in the room because that is where decisions are getting made. And so if we as Jews walk away from it and say, that got too difficult for me, then what does that say about us? How does that further the work? I could have easily walked away the first year of Women's March because it was difficult. I mean, having to really apologize to my entire congregation because I felt like I let them down, and I did, right? But I still need to be in those rooms because oftentimes I am the only Jew in the room of activism. And so even though it gets difficult and some anti-Semitism seriously is so insidious that the person speaking of it does not even know. I've been a person that's been told, oh, you're this like a Jew, you're that like, I'm like, oh, I am a Jew. Where did you hear that? And they don't realize that it's anti-Semitic language. It is in the vernacular. It is just out there. And so being in the room allows me to really identify it and educate them on what it is, because if the word were switched around to the color of skin, if the word were switched around to even sex, we would not accept that language. Right. So it's difficult, but we must be in the room where these decisions are being made, especially when we talk about, the racial reckoning and the racial injustice that is going on. We need to be allies, and it is difficult, but Jewish is difficult.
I so appreciate both of you, and I just want to say I recognize the emotional toll that it takes to stay in spaces where, in some ways, you're on the receiving end of harm, no matter which angle you're coming from, and to choose to keep going back to those spaces because there's important work to be done. I don't think that there's enough gratitude that gets expressed, and I think more often it gets expressed as skepticism of why are you choosing to do this? Why don't you walk away? Isn't that the purer, better thing to do for this part of your identity or that part of your identity? And so I'll say a thank you. As we start to kind of wind down some of the questions, I'm going to move us a little bit back into the personal space. We have a question from somebody who wants to know if your experience in synagogues has been as fraught as some of those stories that you shared in the preschool, or if that feels like it's a different space to navigate.
It's the same space to navigate because it's the same people. I'm very fortunate to I participate in, you can follow me in almost every PTA or parent association because I'm a helicopter parent, I'll say it. So I tend to join the organization so they start to recognize me as part of and belonging, so that when I do show up for service, I don't have that, right? I don't experience that, or that my kids don't experience it. So my work around it is by being present and really, really owning my space there. Because I can't just sort of tiptoe and walk around. I really feel like participating as a parent and putting in the work for the community is key. I did experience that in the beginning, but I don't see that as an issue. As a matter of fact, I was at now my brother-in-law temple in Chicago, and at that point it was my brother who's Jewish and myself at the temple. So they're like, oh, they're all coming now. It was just two of us, and so they were really welcoming, which I think 10 years ago that wouldn't have been the case.
Okay, I have a question from a congregant. I'm gonna reframe it slightly. There's this kind of interesting interplay between being a person of color and Jews by choice, who, if you're a person of color, you are assumed to be a Jew by choice. Sometimes that's accurate, sometimes that's not. I'm really interested to hear from both of you. Emmy, as somebody who is, I don't know if that's a term that you own, Jew by choice, but how is it that you wear that identity? And April, how do you navigate that not being part of your identity? But I'm going to make the assumption that that is sometimes directed towards you.
Emmy, do you want to speak first? I'm still thinking about the last question.
You want to do this first? Yes.
Yeah, that's okay. Yeah.
So I did. I said I met my husband where I was waiting tables, and I did not date him for 5 years because he was very specific about, I am the last Jew in my family. So if you commit to going out with me, we're gonna have kids. I'm like, hold up, but like I just kind of want coffee. I don't. So he was really clear about what being Jewish was meant to him. And I said, I'm sort of not ready. I'm starting businesses. I'm not ready to sort of commit to this. 5 years down the road, we meet again, and so we date and we talk about it, and just seeing what his family had gone through was very similar to what my family had gone through. And so it wasn't a difficult choice to say, okay, this is what we're going to do. And my mother-in-law, once we got married, would actually check out to see if I was ovulating because she was ready to become a kid. I love her. Rest in peace. She was my second mom. But really talking through what it meant for them, how they really needed to make sure that their heritage and legacy was continued. And so I converted, but I didn't really walk around identifying myself as a Latina Jew. I really didn't. I attended temple. We were raising our kids. And it wasn't until I started organizing Women's March that it was really in the public eye, and I wasn't ready for that. I was like, why is this even an issue? Well, it was an issue because the community was being harmed, and I was part of that unless I spoke up. And so I think that was eye-opening for me, and really, I had never had anyone ask me. belong to Temple. I, live my life as a Jew, but now being in the public eye of organizing and having a particular group be anti-Semitic, I really needed to step forward and say this cannot be, and organize in a different manner. But yeah, so I wasn't walking around thinking, oh, I'm going to be the Latina Jew. I just was.
When you asked that question, Rabbi Bassin, the first word that came to mind was like a slightly different variation of that. When I was working at the URJ as the vice president of Audacious Hospitality, a colleague of mine once reluctantly shared, and I'm glad she did, although it was a little painful, that she was talking with one of her best friends about something related to work. And it was like 6 months into her being into this job, and this was regularly her confidant, and her confidant in one of the conversations said, but wait, so is April really Jewish? So the questions at times like go beyond, which is just like, it's that, like, her belief was like that ingrained that the URJ would hire a non-Jew who was posing as like, I don't know, just the whole, that there's just a fundamental at times, because people have been so trained and acculturated to people of color, like that it wasn't about even my specific origin story. It was just like, but is she like really after all that time, I mean, she'd likely been sitting with that for a while and still like couldn't just land on, yeah, she's Jewish. There's been like multiple press things and like all of the other members of the executive, and so that's what comes to mind to me when you ask me that. And I think the other thing that comes to mind is just some interesting demographic trends that are coming. I mean, what's exciting to me in some ways and also challenging is that our current statistics don't include kids. And between people converting to Judaism, interfaith and interracial marriages, transracial adoption, like there is this huge boom among our youth, right? So it's so interesting to me because I think this question, or else maybe I hope it, right, is like a time-bound question. But I think in the next 10 and 20 years, the demographic reality is not going to erase bias, but I think it's going to change the nature of questions and biases. Well, hopefully not. I like to be positive. So hopefully at that point we'll be through those, maybe. But maybe, probably not, but maybe. And so that's really interesting. And one of the things that I saw during my vice presidency that I thought was so cool is that in part because of DNA testing, there were many, and not exclusively, but there were many people of color, specifically descendants of conversos. So specifically Latinx, Latino, Latina, Hispanic identified folks and African heritage people and Asian heritage as well. Not exclusively through DNA, but often like a lot more than you would think. They'd be like, I found out I have Jewish ancestry and I've actually always kind of been interested or I've checked out Judaism and it actually seems really great. And so that's another variable that's a little adjacent to what you're asking, but that I think is also a part of the equation. And in the midst of that, while the increases are happening, so there's both returning and as well as conversion, as well as I'm just really intrigued about the future, like with people, as more celebrities either convert and or just come out as Jewish. I'm really interested to see how this conversation evolves as Jews of color become more normalized in broader American culture, and the shifts that may be happening at a faster pace in the years ahead.
Yeah, it's clear that doing this work now is really setting the entire community up for a wholer foundation for the future of exactly what you're saying, of these trends that we know that are happening. As we wind down, I've got one final question for you, but I'm going to give folks a little bit more framing for what's in store with Temple Emmanuel in this coming year. First of all, the very near future at 4:30, we are going to do an exploration of the Book of Jonah through the eyes of Jews of color. So congregants here at Temple Emmanuel have studied and interpreted the book and are sharing their own stories connected with the Book of Jonah at 4:30. It's a half-hour program. I strongly encourage for you to check out the stories that are in our midst. And then throughout the year, we are going to be working with Gamal Palmer, who is a local consultant here in racial justice work. And he is going to be working with different subsets of our community, from religious school parents to the sisterhood, to the board, to the staff, for us to start to really do this work with humility and showing up. Really grateful for that language. And a big thank you to the Barrett Family Foundation for their support, not just of today's forum, but for all of this programming focus on Jews of color throughout the entire year. I do want to remind you that not every program is underwritten by the generous Barrett family. And if you do want to continue to support our work, please, please, please go to tebh.org/give and help us to keep our work going in this particularly difficult year with COVID, as we are doing our best to support people in our community who are also very much struggling from the illness and from the financial implications of it. We want to make sure to keep our community healthy and strong. So for those who are able, we thank you for your generosity. Okay, let's bring April and Emmy back up, because the final question that I want to ask you two is, I would imagine with the current climate as it is, you are much more in demand as speakers, as consultants. It's got to be a lot. It's got to be a lot to carry. But I wonder what's keeping you energized, and what are those nuggets that are giving you hope that tomorrow is going to be different than yesterday?
I would say my kids and my community. I think people have stepped up in such different ways. I think for me, and anybody that knows me knows that I did not like being in the public eye. I was that volunteer that would organize Forum Carnival and do all of that in the background. But my community has really stepped up. I think it gives me hope that we are listening to what is going on in the world. And, I think part of really working through some of these issues, where right now we're really working on the racial issue, as part of being Jewish. This is what we do. We see an injustice and we step forward. And again, I talk through it sometimes being difficult and messy, but we get it done, right? We really do. And having that safe space, I would say, I welcome anybody to reach out to me. Having that safe space of, I don't understand this. I had a neighbor across the street from me who is Jewish, attends a different synagogue, but said, Emmy, can I talk to you about racism? Does it really exist? Who am I to judge? I just said, okay, let's talk about it. What is it that you don't understand? How can I help? Without shaming, without judgment. Some of us know what we know and some of us don't. And it's up to all of us to really help people understand where we are in this moment and how we can move forward. I think for me, what's keeping me hopeful is that people are still listening. People are still getting involved. And again, it may be messy, but we're willing to step into leadership. So that keeps me hopeful.
Thank you. April.
This has been such a joy. What keeps me hopeful is a variety of different things. I was thinking, I looked it up, so you heard typing, because I wanted to confirm. So basically, as Eleanor Roosevelt said, the future belongs to those who believe in the beauty of their dreams. So part of what keeps me hopeful is that I am really stubbornly attached to my vision of collective liberation. And I know a bunch of other people who are super brilliant, who are also committed to fostering a world of wholeness, justice, and compassion. And so what keeps me hopeful is seeing a number of us continuing to iterate and continuing to take the breaks that we need, but staying focused and also getting better as we go. And with each blow, also reevaluating and honing and getting better in its best form, right? And so that keeps me hopeful. And even while there's chaos around, I'm so inspired by two of my ancestors, my Gram, who was the descendant of Pennsylvania coal miners, and my Grandpa Joe, who was a descendant of an enslaved Black man who went through horrific scenarios and were always so joyful, even in the midst of the storm. And I've been channeling their energy and wisdom a lot these days. And there's so many people out there like them. So I'm hopeful about all of the resources that we have at our fingertips that can move us forward, and just a really rugged stubbornness of, I am going to achieve this or move this forward or die trying. And there are a bunch of other people who are like me. So even if we fail tomorrow, we're going to keep going and get better and get stronger and win again. So that is what keeps me hopeful, is just this willful joy and commitment to justice and revolutionary love.
Well, thank you both for your brute hopefulness and resilience, and keeping this work going forward. What a joy it has been to have this conversation with you today. I just want to leave on a rabbinic note that we're fasting today, not just for personal transformation, but our prophets really do remind us that if this fast is divorced from the real systemic and societal change that we know needs to happen, then it's a fast in vain. The fast that we need to do is a fast that is one that strengthens our spiritual energy, to give us a taste of the resilience that April and Emmy are modeling for us, so that we can go out into this world and do this work. So I'm going to wish everybody a Gamar Chatima Tova. May you be sealed in the book of life for good, and a meaningful fast. Thank you all.